Hi, everybody, and welcome to Odd Week Sunday School at St. Andrew's Covenant Presbyterian Church. This is our lesson for January 3rd, and I really hope that you are having a refreshing and peaceful or maybe exciting Christmas season. We are still in the church season of Christmastide. Today, our text is from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. And today I want to read this text first, right off the bat, before I say very much about it. You might want to look this up so that as I refer to it, you can have it handy, John 1, 1 to 18. But this time that I read it first thing, I invite you to just listen and maybe not follow along, but even maybe close your eyes. This is one of the most beautiful passages that's ever gotten itself translated into English. And as I read it, you might think to yourself, what words or images stand out for you? So, the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." If you were going to sit down and make yourself write the story of the gospel story, to write a testimony, we might say, to try your best to explain what you believe about Jesus, where would you start? Let's say that's our assignment. Just the first step of the story today. Don't worry about how many chapters your story will have. Don't worry about the word count or how you're going to end it. Just try to figure out how to start it. What's the opening paragraph, the introduction? I think anyone who's ever tried to write anything, and if you've been to high school or even fourth grade, you have tried to write something. And whether or not this is something that you do often or something relegated to a distant past, you probably know that that first part, that first paragraph, remember how fussy the teacher always was about that, about the introduction. Because if you get the intro wrong, the reader might never figure out what it is you're actually talking about. And if you get the intro wrong, the reader might never get the main point. In journalism, they call it burying the lead. Before you can figure out how to lead people into your story, you have to figure out what you think the story is really about. What is the point of this story? And that's not always as easy as it sounds. Even though it's often quite useful to try to write at least a sort of a half-baked introduction before you go on to write your story, It's probably the case that you're not going to write the final version, the polished version of your introduction until after you've written the whole thing, until after you've seen how the story ends. That's when you can really begin to see where it started. Well, we have not one, of course, but 4 gospel writers in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are the testimonies, these 4, that the early Bible compilers, the early church fathers, thought to be the most reliable accounts of the life and times of Jesus. And as you probably know, these 4 accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they have a lot in common. There are many common stories in them, especially the ending. The ending of the story of Jesus, or the place where each of them ended their telling of that story. It's quite similar in each of the gospel accounts, isn't it? There was an arrest, there was a trial, there was a conviction, there was an execution by crucifixion, there was a resurrection. We can see why that seemed like the climax of the story to all of the writers. But the beginning of these 4 stories, there's not as much agreement among these 4 tellers about where the story of Jesus begins. And that's a pretty significant question too, isn't it? For Matthew, the story of Jesus begins with Abraham, with whom God had made a covenant promise. And then Matthew recounts a long genealogy connecting Abraham to Jesus. He's stressing, especially to Jewish readers, that Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel, that Jesus is the promised one of Israel. Mark, who's famous for cutting to the chase, he starts his gospel with a prophecy from Isaiah, again suggesting that Jesus is the fulfillment of an ancient promise, a prophecy from Isaiah about the messenger who will prepare the way for the Messiah, John the Baptist. In Mark, we first hear about John, who pointed the way to Jesus. In Luke, we get many of the elements that find their way into our Christmas pageants. We get angels, we get shepherds. In chapter 1 of Luke, we first get a prophecy about the birth of John the Baptist, and then a prophecy about the birth of Jesus announced to women, which introduces us to Jesus' mother Mary, who's recognized as herself something of a prophet here in Luke's account. And then Luke's story really zeroes in on the birth narrative, on the fact of nativity, the nitty-gritty of being born human, which is a very strong bookend to the ending of Luke's gospel, which involves dying a human death. And then there's the 4th gospel, the Gospel of John, and that's our text for today. Well, our format in these Odd Week Sunday School classes is very unsatisfactory because I really want to hear what were the words, what were the images that you picked out when I read that passage. And I can't hear them right now. Maybe some of them were word, light, life, flesh, grace and truth. Why does John start his gospel this way? It's unique. What's he driving at here? Before he talks about John the Baptist, he gives us mysterious poetry, a sort of poetic theology. This is not an empirical analysis or historical account of who is Jesus or who is God. It's an effort to sculpt an image of Jesus out of beautiful materials, so that we who hear these words gain an impression. We are bid to enter into something that's well beyond words, something even our finest writing cannot fully contain, the Word made flesh. I think the fancy word for that is incarnation, carne, flesh, meat. God made himself human. Another good word for this that we usually hear applied in the negative is condescension. God came down to our level. Thanks be to God. John wants us to know, before he gets into the chapters and the verses about what Jesus, the Son of God and the Son of Man, did with his days walking on the earth, what he taught his disciples and the crowds that gathered around him, John wants us to know right from the beginning who Jesus is. And John has figured out what he thinks is the answer to that question. John is claiming that Jesus is nothing less than God among us. This is what it looks like, he says, to be in the presence of God. It looks like breaking bread with this teacher. It looks like being instructed by this preacher. It looks like having our feet washed by this friend. And that's something new in the Holy Scriptures, I think. For all the wonderful and profound things that we learn in the Old Testament about who God is and what God is like, I don't think we quite get this picture. That God would be our friend and come over for dinner. That God would get thirsty in the heat of the day and ask me to give him a drink of water. That God would wash our feet and say, look, I'm just asking you for one thing, love one another. John wants us to know that that's where the story of Jesus begins. The light and life of the world took on flesh and dwelt among us. That's the main point of the whole story, he's saying. So keep it in mind. The phrase that stood out for me when I read this passage this week was grace and truth, which are linked together 2 times in this passage, in verse 14 and verse 17. Grace and truth. The Father's Son, he says, was full of grace and truth. The law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Well, grace and truth must be very important if the Word was made flesh so that we could receive it. I'm wondering what John was thinking about when he used that phrase, grace and truth. What did he mean? Well, if we take them separately, we could have a whole theology class here. What's grace? Well, that question can take us into the history of the Protestant Reformation, the long argument about the sufficiency of grace alone. What's grace? It's amazing, as the famous song says. Grace is what God grants us out of his own goodness, not on account of our goodness. We like to think about grace, God's goodness to us, about our unworthiness and his graciousness. Grace is a joyful thing to ponder. We're pleased to consent to that idea that Jesus brings grace. Jesus both teaches about and in his own life shows God's grace. And then there's truth. How about truth? What is truth? Maybe we've slipped out of theology class and into philosophy class. Or heaven forbid, we've stumbled into politics. Isn't truth something we disagree about? Something we debate about? Something we maybe even fight about? Isn't it something people have even killed themselves over? Are we smiling at the thought of truth? Is the truthfulness of God something that makes us joyful? As far as I know, we don't have a song called Amazing Truth. Is it possible for people to know for sure what's true about God? This gets us into such a tangle that we need something concrete to think with here. And maybe what we need to understand truth is not an argument, but a flesh and blood person who can not only tell us, but show us what is true about God. Maybe what John wants us to understand is that God in his grace has given us his Son, made out of what we're made out of, who walked the earth in real time and whose real actual life speaks a word to us about the real actual God. What is the truth about God? Jesus Christ. In his introduction, John links the grace of God to the truth of Jesus. Here's the word embodied. And when we find ourselves needing to know who God is, what God asks of us, where God is sending us, why God is bothering with us, maybe why God is bothering us. Whatever it is we find ourselves really needing to know about God, the primary source, as we say in the history business, the first text is Jesus Christ. In the flesh and blood Jesus, we read truths we wouldn't be smart enough or patient enough to understand any other way. If we want to know what's true about God, we need to take in the story of Jesus. And that's what John seems to be driving at in his introduction. As introductions go, I have to hand it to John, the gospel writer. If this one doesn't grab your attention, nothing will. This is the book of life, and you won't outgrow it. And in the days ahead, if you find yourself in a dark corner, remember the illumination, the light of this story, and keep reading. Until next time, be well.